My name is Yaga Richter. I'm a scientist at NCAR and the lead organizer of the NCAR Explorer series. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the MESA Laboratory and to the fourth lecture in the NCAR Explorer series. NCAR, or the National Center for Atmospheric Research, is a world-leading organization dedicated to the study of the atmosphere, the Earth system, and the Sun. Our scientists and engineers are very passionate about their work they do here, and through this series, they share their passion for scientific discovery with you and a global audience through our live stream and archive presentations. Today's lecture presents a topic that is one of the greatest challenges of our time, climate change. More specifically, Dr. Joanie Kleypas will discuss how climate change affects the tropical oceans and ecosystems. Climate change and its consequences can be challenging to process. Hence, after the presentations, I invite you to ask lots of questions, engage in conversation with other members of the audience, Joanie, and other event staff. Let me briefly introduce Joanie to you. Joanie grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, a major refinery town in an area of Texas that was often referred to as the Petropolis. Joanie's father was a refinery worker. Joanie was the fifth out of 7 kids, hence most of the time she was left alone to do what she wanted. Since very early in life, Joanie wanted to be a marine ecologist and loved the underwater world of her parents' swimming pool. She also loved watching a TV series entitled The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, which brought oceans to people's living room. Joanie went to a local college called Lamar University, one of the few undergraduate institutions in the United States that had oceanography as a major. After completing her bachelor's degree, Joanie went to the University of South Carolina for her master's work, where she researched how fish were using marshes as feeding grounds. Joanie went to Australia for her PhD on a Fulbright scholarship. There, she had the opportunity to drill through reefs, coring down approximately 100 feet in order to learn what made a good place for coral reefs to grow. After she completed her PhD in 1994, she moved to Boulder, Colorado, so she could be in the same town as her husband, and started her career as a scientist. Joanie is now a world-renowned scientist and travels around the world talking about coral reefs and climate change. She's one of the first people to call attention to the problem of ocean acidification and has testified in front of Congress several times. Just 2 weeks ago, Joanie came back from a 6-month sabbatical in Costa Rica, where she worked on reef restoration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joanie Kleypas.
Thanks, Yaga. Thanks a lot. I'm going to start off by saying thank you so much for being interested in this topic and for coming to NCAR to hear these talks. I think it's such a great idea. NCAR is a great place to work. It's really one of the best places to work anywhere that I've been, and it's really a privilege to work here. And I really thank Jim Harrell and people of UCAR and NCAR for really promoting this series. I want to give particular thanks to Yaga. She has done the lion's share of the work to pull us together and keep us in order. I wanted to play music in my talks, and I couldn't because they were on top of it and realized that I couldn't breach copyright laws. So thank you for saving me. I also want to thank Paul Martinez because he's done a lot of work getting this to work properly for me. Larissa, who's standing here with me, keeping me company. Jim Hurl, the president of NCAR, who's promoted this, and then particularly all of you for being interested in this topic. I don't want to come here and talk about how coral reefs are going to die. Okay, so this is really not my gig. We could talk doomsday, and I could make a case for doomsday, but I don't think doomsday is going to happen. And what I want to do is tell you what the real problems are, that yes, we're facing a real crisis with coral reefs, but what I want to do is tell you the kind of things we're doing to try to buy some time for coral reefs until we get our act together and do something about climate change. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump right into this. First of all, lots of people on here, and I could put a lot more people up here in addition to this, but to just pull this talk together, this is not about me. This is not about all my research. This is about a lot of other people's research. And I think almost all scientists work in this way, particularly now. It's a really interdisciplinary time for science these days. Okay, let's get going. So coral reefs. So what are they? Or where are they? So coral reefs are actually all over the place in the tropics. They're in places you may have not ever thought of, like in the southern part of Africa or on the western coast of Africa or lots of places down here. But they're pretty widespread. There's not a lot of area. About 1% of the ocean has coral reefs within it. You could take all these coral reefs, God forbid, and fit them in the state of Texas. Okay? So there's not a lot, but they are really valuable real estate. They support a lot of other life on the planet. And so it's really important to look at these. Even though they're the canary in the coal mine, they are really important systems to keep around. So what are they? Well, this is a satellite view of coral reefs. They're one of the only marine ecosystems you can see like this. They are both biological ecosystems and geological. So the white material you see here, this is the northern tip of the Great Barrier Reef. So the white material you see in here, these are all coral reefs, and you can see them from space. So if we blow that up, you can get a better idea of what these coral reefs look like. That's a lot of calcium carbonate that these things produce. And it's really just fascinating. If you were to get into a plane and fly over them, you would see something that looks like this, and the width of these reefs is probably 2 kilometers wide, something like that. So it's a fascinating system that very few of us have the opportunity to really see. So this is an underwater view. One of the most important things about these reefs, because they are kind of geological, they build these really complex structures that support a lot of other biodiversity, a lot of other organisms. So their biodiversity levels are extremely high. Okay, they're one of the most biodiverse systems on the planet. They're called, rainforests of the ocean, although coral reefs call rainforests coral reefs of the land. Okay. So what I want you to do here is I want you to try to imagine you're underwater in this system. This is a hard thing to do unless you've been scuba diving a lot. Imagine that you're underwater in this visual world. We usually think of them with our sight, but if you think of them in terms of how they smell, there's a ton of chemicals here, and the organisms navigate by smell. They detect smells. There's a lot of water motion, so you're under there and you feel a lot of water motion under there. So there's a sense of water flowing all the time. The reef itself can be pretty slimy. So if you just imagine that, or it can be sharp in places. We all have scars to prove that, people that have been diving there. And if I'm missing anything, the last thing would be sound, okay? They're actually not a very quiet place. People are putting recorders down there, and they're starting to understand that there's a lot of sounds, and a lot of organisms make sounds. So I'm going to play this, and I want you just to see if you can pick up within this background static that sounds like frying bacon. That frying bacon sound that you're going to hear is going to be snapping shrimp, make a lot of noise. But then you're going to hear these purrs and these grunts and these other sounds. So just think about it and see if you can pick up some of these sounds. Pretty cool, huh? Could you hear? You might have to listen to these things a few times to really start picking up the things, but there's actually, on coral reefs, just like on land, there's a morning chorus. When the sun comes up, you start getting these sequence of sounds that comes in. So it's a very living, just alive place where, a lot of organisms live and make their lives and have to negotiate all of these chemicals in the water that they can smell, the sounds, the water motion, and so forth. So it's really a fascinating place. So we all know that corals and coral reefs are under threat right now. There's three major ways that they're threatened. They're threatened by various types of pollution. They're threatened by exploitation, like overfishing or people harvesting corals or taking the fish for aquarium industry or all sorts of things. And they're also threatened by climate change. So I'm not going to talk much about the lower two categories of pollution and exploitation, but I will talk a lot about climate change. That's what I do. I work here on how climate change affects coral reefs here, so I'm going to walk you through these various things. Okay, first of all, just basic background lesson about climate change today. It's caused by rising levels of greenhouse gases. The main one is carbon dioxide, CO2. And we put a lot of that in the atmosphere, mainly by fossil fuel burning, but also by deforestation. So we have two major sources. There's several other sources too, but those are the main ones. That carbon goes up into the atmosphere, but it doesn't all stay there. About 44% of that carbon that we put into the atmosphere remains in the atmosphere. The rest of it is taken up by plants on the planet. So our forests and our plants take up about 30% of it, and then the oceans take up about 26% of it, depending on the year. You have different amounts, but it's about that amount. That does us a big favor. The oceans are doing us a big favor by taking up that CO2. Without the oceans, our rate of climate change would be much worse. So this is how it works. So we have these little CO2, carbon dioxide molecules, increasing in the atmosphere. Just one carbon, two oxygens. The oxygens are blue, the carbon is white here. And when we have more of that, it causes the atmosphere to warm up, so we have atmospheric warming. But a lot of that heat, over 90% of it, ends up in the ocean. So the oceans warm up. Okay? So there's a lot of ocean warming going along with that. And also, some of those molecules are taken up by the ocean. This is a very basic law of chemistry called Henry's Law. And basically it just says if you have an increase in pressure in a gas adjacent to a liquid, you will drive more of that gas into the liquid. So more of it will dissolve in, and it's proportionate to whatever that concentration is. So it's not really too difficult to believe that as we put CO2 into the atmosphere, more of it goes in the ocean. That's what we call ocean acidification. So here show you two graphs of where we are and where we're headed. We are here. This is the year 1950 through the year 2100. This is a temperature curve here, and we're about in this area right now. And so when we think about our future, NCAR is a big participant in producing some of these predictions. This lower one, which is called a representative carbon pathway, 2.6, that's what we hope for. We hope that we can control our carbon emissions to the point where we will keep our temperatures below 2 degrees above what it used to be. That's the goal. But for a long time, that's where we were headed along this red curve, which is really not a good curve to be on. And hopefully we will keep closer to this lower curve. There's a lot of agreements now with the Paris agreements on climate change, and a lot of progress this year. And so there is definitely hope that we will be following the better curve. With ocean pH, if we look at the ocean surface, it's absorbing that carbon dioxide. And when you add carbon dioxide to water, you form carbonic acid, and the pH goes down. It's a pretty simple concept as well. pH has been pretty stable for a long, long time. Again, we're here now. If we look at the hopeful scenario, we will only go down this much, but pH has the potential for going down as much as that, which would be pretty dreadful for a lot of marine organisms. So let's talk about the biggest problem with climate change, with temperature change on coral reefs. That's coral bleaching. How many people have heard of coral bleaching? Yes, you're a well-informed crowd for sure. This is what a normal reef looks like. You see a lot of biodiversity. You see a lot of colors on the reef. You see a lot of structure. When we have something like bleaching, which we had a lot of this year, the corals lose their color, and I'll explain why in a minute. And they lose a lot of the other species that are associated with the coral reefs. If these reefs can't recover, if reefs like this can't recover, then the natural processes that break down reefs, okay, will just become dominant, and the reef will eventually look something like this, right? So there's very little biodiversity in this plot. So again, it's the structure that the reefs build, this calcium carbonate, that really makes them supporters of this really high marine biodiversity. So what is coral bleaching? So I brought a couple corals, and we can look at these after I'm done talking. So these are coral skeletons. People have seen these in shops and stuff. I shouldn't have this. This is illegal, right? But this is a very common coral in the Pacific. I have another one here too. These are calcium carbonate. It's a mineral, so you can hear it, right? It's just a rock. It's aragonite. It's very similar to calcite. If you guys had that in high school or college. And the organism just lives as a thin sheet on top of this coral. Every little hole in here is occupied by a coral polyp, and they're colonial, so they're all connected, and over time they secrete this calcium carbonate structure. So you can imagine this is just a great place for fish to hide, right? If anyone's had an aquarium, they put something in there, where do the fish go? They go immediately to the structure. Okay. So coral bleaching, what happens is that there is algae that lives in the tissue of the coral. And that algae, and here's a picture of a coral polyp. See the algae that live right in here? That algae photosynthesizes. Coral is an animal. It's related to anemones. But it has this really neat, ingenious evolutionary tactic. It has these algae that live in its tissues, photosynthesizes, and it gives the coral energy. So it can feed. It still has a mouth. It still has tentacles. But it also has this capacity to just feed by sunlight. So if we were to do genetic engineering, we should genetically engineer ourselves to have these algae that live in our tissues, right? Then we'd all be hanging out in the sun all the time and wouldn't have to eat. When these things get hot or stressed for a multitude of reasons, these algae just ramp up. They start photosynthesizing like crazy. They produce these free radicals that start damaging the tissue of the coral, and the coral just expels them into the water column. So the algae are gone. The coral becomes transparent. So even though you may have a bleached coral, you may not even see the tissue anymore because it's transparent. All you will see is the coral underneath, and we call it bleached because they're white, because you're seeing the skeleton instead of the algae. So that's the process of coral bleaching. When we try to measure whether coral reefs or corals are at risk of becoming bleached due to water temperature, we use something called a degree heating week. It was developed by some people at NOAA. It's a very useful way of tracking just how hot the water is and for how long it's been hot. And so the way we do it is just a very simple formula. We look at 12-week period. We look at how long the corals have been above their normal maximum temperature, and we start adding up that excess temperature week after week. So for example, if we have coral that's been in water that's been like a degree, just 1 degree above its normal maximum temperature for 3 weeks, then we have a degree heating week of 3 weeks. If we then have another 4 weeks where the temperature went up even higher for 2 degrees, then the degree heating week is 8. We add those up for a 12-week period, we have a degree heating week of 11. That coral would be bleaching with that amount of heat stress. So that's how we measure it. We are currently we are in the 3rd global bleaching event. When I first started working on coral reefs and studying coral reefs basically in the 70s, we knew about bleaching, but it didn't happen because of heat stress. We usually saw it because of freshwater runoff. We usually saw it for some other stress, even getting too cold. And then over time, we started seeing more and more of this as we saw temperatures spike in certain areas, but it wasn't common. In 97, 98, it was a big wake-up call for coral reef scientists. It was a big El Nino. I don't know if any of you went to Kevin Trimber's talk, but he talks a lot about El Nino, and it's a good way to get a background on that. The ocean temperatures in the tropics got very warm, and it bleached coral reefs all over the place. Not every coral reef, but in every ocean we had quite a bit of bleaching and a lot of coral mortality. The estimates are over 15% of reefs worldwide were basically wiped out. That was 97, 98. Then reefs recovered for a while after that big event. And in 2010, there's another El Nino event, had another global bleaching event. And right now we're in the third. And this third one's getting a lot of attention, mainly because of, it hit the Great Barrier Reef really, really hard. This is where bleaching has occurred since 2014. It's still going on in some areas. So every little red dot shows where bleaching has occurred. And again, the Great Barrier Reef was one of the hardest hit areas. I'm going to show you a video. If you get seasick, just look at the Northern Great Barrier Reef or something. But this shows you coral bleaching. The fish are all still here. This is a pretty recent event, and these corals haven't died yet, but they're white, most of them. You'll also notice in some of these corals, you'll see some like fluorescence. You'll see some really pastel. It's kind of beautiful in some of these cases. That's when the algae have been expelled, but some of the photosynthetic pigments remained in the coral, and they're still fluorescing in the sunlight. So this was a pretty widespread event, particularly in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. And let this run through so you can see the rest of it. See the pink corals, how fluorescent they are. And at the very end, you see this tape in the background. That's where some scientists are taking some of the transects to actually take the data and document how much bleaching. So how bad was it? So we heard a lot of news about the Northern Great Barrier Reef getting hit really hard by coral bleaching. They're now collecting data, or still collecting data, on just whether these reefs are going to recover, or how much mortality we have. So in the Northern Barrier Reef, the mortality for corals is about half the corals died so far. So that's a pretty big hit in the northern part of the reef. In this reef, these reefs up here are pretty pristine. They don't have a lot of other stresses on these reefs. So some of the areas where I used to work, here, and here, had much less. So what's interesting is that you can have a big bleaching event, but some areas are impacted really hard. It's just like a drought, right, on land, and some areas are completely fine. So the hope here is that the parts of the reef that remain healthy will be able to reseed some of the reefs that have been really wiped out. And that's some of the science that we try to work on and understand. Okay, with ocean acidification, I don't want to give you a lot of chemistry, okay? That's the last thing I want to do. But I will explain it with cartoon chemistry, okay? So this is a really easy way to conceptualize it. So we have carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere. Some of that carbon dioxide is going into the water column. When it combines with water, you form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is weak. It immediately dissociates into a bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. That causes the pH to go down. That makes the water more acidic. But some of those hydrogen ions combine with another thing called carbonate to form more bicarbonate. So we're shifting the chemical balance of these carbonate and bicarbonate ions in the seawater. And that's important. we have a lot of bicarbonate in the oceans. A lot. We have a little bit of carbonate in the oceans. So when we do this, when we take some of that carbonate out and convert it to bicarbonate, we have less carbonate. So what do marine organisms use to secrete their calcium carbonate shells? They use calcium and carbonate. There's less carbonate, and there's less available for building their skeletons. It's like osteoporosis. It's like not getting enough calcium in your diet or not getting enough other things in your diet that can cause your bones to not grow as well. I also want to talk about the pH scale, because that's what ocean acidification is. And people that don't believe in climate change often bring this up, that we call it ocean acidification. But look, the oceans, seawater, is always going to remain around 8. That's still basic. That's still alkaline. Okay? We use the term ocean acidification the same way we use warming. When you say the poles are warming, we're not saying that the poles are going to get hot. We're just saying that the waters are warming. It's the same thing with acidification. We're not saying that the oceans are going to become acid. We're saying they're just becoming more acidic. So I just like to clarify that issue so that you can understand what it means. The pH is a logarithmic scale. So when we have a pH change from 7 to 6, that's a 10 times increase in acidity. Okay, so we're looking at some pretty big shifts. Seawater is around 8.1, 8.2 normally. It's a little bit higher in some parts of the tropics, and corals love it. Anybody that has an aquarium knows. They knew way before we said anything about acidification that keeping your pH up and keeping your calcium levels up made the corals grow like crazy. Okay, so we were behind the times when we started talking about this. But when we talk about some of these natural substances, just a comparison of what the pHs are. I always like to throw in, because I always get asked this, what is beer? So beer's about that. And then I realized last minute that this is Boulder, so I put in wine too. Okay, so here's the chemistry broken down into these components. Carbon dioxide, we know what that is. That's in water too. Plants love carbon dioxide. They also love bicarbonate, the green one. Carbonate is what we use to secrete shells, and the pH is what I was just talking about. So if we look at when carbon dioxide was pre-industrial, before we started burning fossil fuels here, this was the relative proportions. The piece of the pie here of carbonate was about this big. When we increase those levels, we double it, which is what we expect in a few decades, that pie reduces. And then when we go even further, it reduces even more. So that kind of gives you just this conceptual notion that the proportion of these things is changing. The reason that's important is because with acidification, it's not just pH, okay? It's a whole suite of chemicals that are changing, and organisms use all of them, okay? So we look at carbon dioxide and bicarbonate. Plants love that. We have some plants like seagrasses which grow better with ocean acidification because there's more carbon dioxide to use in photosynthesis and bicarbonate. The thing that we worry about with reefs is this carbonate ion concentration going down, and that affects a lot of organisms, not just corals, but it affects almost anything that secretes calcium carbonate. And then the pH. The pH is interesting because the pH affects organisms' physiology. And I have Nemo here because there's been some recent evidence that shows that these clownfish, when they're juveniles, when they're babies, looking for their own anemone, they lose their sense of smell. So remember, sense of smell is really important for reef organisms. But when they turn up the pH, when they're raised in low pH waters, they can't detect proper places to go. They lose their way to navigate, and they lose their ability to detect predators like sharks and other predatory fish. So they become brave. They'll swim right up to a fish and they get eaten. And this has been shown in the field, and it's been shown in the lab. Nemo may be okay in some sense, but sharks seem to show the same problem too. So not only do these fish lose their ability to detect their predators, but some of these sharks are losing their ability to detect the prey. So we don't know how this is going to play out. It's a really interesting direction of the science. But to get back to the corals and the calcification, there's been a lot of studies on how much corals will slow down their calcification rate. It can be really confusing. Some corals don't show much of a response, and other ones show a huge response. These are the adult corals, the ones that have already settled and that are growing. But overall, by the end of the century, on average, about 20% decrease in calcification. So that means a lot. It means a lot not only for that individual coral, but it means a lot for how it builds the reef and keeps the reef growing. So this is the other thing, though. Like most marine organisms, corals have a pretty complex life cycle. For one, they start off in the water column floating around as plankton in the water column. They're floating, right? They're floating around and they're looking for a place to settle. And when they find a good place to settle, then they attach and they glue really quickly. They glue themselves with a little bit of calcium carbonate into a spot to hold them there so that they can start growing. Then they become juveniles, and when they get to a certain size, they become an adult, and they spawn, and they form these larvae, which then spread out in the water column again. Well, these coral spawning events are pretty amazing. These are mass spawning events. Has anyone witnessed one of these or been in the water column? Right? Yeah. It's pretty amazing, right? What did you notice about them that just... floating up? Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's pretty amazing. It's cloudy. It's smelly. And a lot of organisms know when it's going to happen before it happens. I don't know if you saw that too, but you can see these things I've never seen before crawl out of places I never knew they were, and they're ready to feast on these eggs and these sperm in the water column. They just go crazy. It's like a big fiesta night, right, on the reef. And and they all get in the water column, and they just hope that they combine and they fertilize and they get carried off someplace to a reef where it's nice and habitable and they can live and grow up, right? On the right-hand side is what we call a coral slick. That's a lot of that stuff like the day after a big party, okay? And you've got this stuff floating in the water, and these birds take it and they bring it out to sea. And a lot of these larvae can live up to 100 days or more, right? Most of them settle out within about 5 days. Most of them settle on their own reef. But it's really important that some of them get out there and settle, away from their own reef. So this is after the larvae have been floating around the water column, and when they're trying to find a place to settle, they use, as far as we know so far, they use a couple things. One, they smell. So they smell this red material here called coral and algae. This coral and algae puts out a chemical, and the corals detect it, and when they detect it, they will start swimming down. The little larvae will start swimming down and settling on the reef. They also can hear the reef. They can hear those sounds I was playing before. So if they're out there in the middle of the ocean floating around and they hear it, they will slowly try to settle down so that they can actually settle in a proper place. Otherwise, they'll just drift out to sea. So this video shows these are little larvae that are trying to settle in on this coral and algae. And I wanted to show you this little thing to the lower right, these former coral lattice. That's where a little coral tried to settle and didn't make it. He settled, he laid down the first skeleton, and he didn't make it. You'll see one coral larvae think that's the best thing in the world. He's going to settle right back on it, right? But I'll just play this so you can see. They're really cute. They're looking for a good place to settle, and they kind of wiggle in like this, right? And then they flatten out, and they start secreting their calcium carbonate skeleton and start growing new corals. It's really cute. But one of the things ocean acidification does, okay, these coral and algae don't produce the chemicals as strongly when there is a low pH condition. So the corals may drift right over this and not settle down because they don't have the chemicals in the water that tells them the coral and algae is there. So that's what makes this life stage quite vulnerable. The other thing that makes it vulnerable is the fact that this calcium carbonate it lays down under low pH is weaker. They just cannot secrete as much down, so the glue is not as good. And so first fish that comes around, you know, parrotfish or some of these blennies and stuff, they're just like bulls in a china closet. They just start knocking these things over and they don't make it. So the mortality rates are higher because they're not glued as strongly to their original settling place. And then this is just a picture of one of these early stages of the coral, which is, again, it's trying to get its start in the world. It's starting to grow its tentacles, and it's laying down that calcium carbonate. You can almost see the calcium carbonate through the coral, that little bright spot down there that it's secreting onto the surface. That is probably the most vulnerable stage of corals when it comes to ocean acidification, because this is the stage where we have much fewer corals recruiting when we have low pH, because they can't get, first they can't sense their habitat, and then they can't glue themselves down. And how do we know this? Well, there's been a ton of work done in the lab, but when you look at the real world, you want to see that this is actually happening. And there's a few places in the world called champagne sites. And this is where, because of volcanic activity, CO2, carbon dioxide, is naturally bubbling up through the surface. People have done a lot of studies on this, because if you're right in the plume, you have a low pH, and it mimics future conditions. But if you swim outside of the plume, 100 meters or a few hundred meters, you have natural conditions. So you can see, like this natural laboratory in the field, what pH does to these coral reef organisms. This is an example of one off of Papua New Guinea. So if we look to the left side here, this is fairly normal pH. This is away from any of these plumes. You see high biodiversity. You see high coral growth and high recruitment. But as you move towards lower and lower pH, you see that you end up with just a loss of biodiversity, and reef erosion increases. So not only is the coral not growing as fast, the processes that break the reef down become more efficient under low pH, and so the reef breaks down more quickly. So these kind of give us a clue that the experiments that we're doing in the lab actually is a good representation of what's happening. So that's all depressing stuff, right? I worked on this stuff for a long time, and I think about 10 years ago, a group of us said, we can't just watch this happen, right? We can sit here and do our science and just say, oh, it's just getting worse. Yep, this year's worse than last year. That year was worse than the year before. So a lot of people are trying to figure out what we can do. So as exposure to climate change increases, we need more and more interventions to maintain viable reefs. Okay, so here's exposure on this axis here. Exposure is increasing, and here's the level of intervention. If we don't have exposure to climate change, we don't have to do anything about it. We just let them go. But as we get higher and higher up, we have to start doing things to protect these organisms. We can protect specific species like we do with the Endangered Species Act. We can make marine protected areas and cordon off the whole ecosystem. We can do reef restoration. We can try to grow things back the way we do with forests. We can do something called assisted evolution, assisted migration, and ex situ conservation. So yeah, we can do a lot of these things, and people are working on every one of these things right now. Not a lot, but there's a lot of hopeful stuff coming out. But the thing to remember on this axis is that the higher up we go on this scale, it's going to cost a lot more, it's going to take a lot more people to do it, and it's going to involve a lot more risk to do it. And I'll explain that in the next slides. So the first thing that we've done, and most of you are familiar with, is protection of coral reefs, of coral species, individual coral species. So the coral species that are outlined in red here, Acropora cervicornis and Acropora palmata, those were the dominant species on Caribbean reefs. They were everywhere. I mean, this species on the lower right here, Acropora palmata, it's also called the elkhorn coral, and this one is called the staghorn coral. Okay, so deer and elk. There was so much of this you could hardly get out to the reef. Right? It was everywhere. It was almost a nuisance species. It grows fast. It's fantastic. Well, because of a combination of factors over the last 30, 40 years, these things started dying off. They died off from disease, from bleaching, from direct impacts of hurricanes, lots of stuff like that. They're now considered endangered by the IUCN. It's sad to see. I mean, I can go out to these same reefs and you just have to look for these coral species to see them come back. But that's one way to protect them, is to just say, these are important, you can't take them, you can't touch them, you have to leave them alone. Some of the things we're seeing more of now are marine protected areas. This is one area where I've been doing a lot of work at NCAR. It is Indonesia. So this is Australia here, this is Asia here, and then this is Papua New Guinea. This is a big, big area in the tropics. This is the center of marine biodiversity. It's got so many organisms, and they're still describing species, new species all the time. There were about 6 nations that got together and said, we have to do something and protect our marine environments. And it's been a very successful effort, and a lot of people have been involved here. But they don't have much data here. It's hard to know what to do when you don't have a lot of data. Some of the work we're doing at NCAR is we're working with Nature Conservancy. In this marine protected area, we're using our modeling to help them identify where are the best places we should be conserving corals. Where should we put in these marine parks? Where should we do something about overfishing? So it's been a really interesting exercise. So the coral triangle, this is a picture of some of the modeling we've done. The coral triangle is outlined in these orange dashed area here. And we built a model that covers all of it. The pink are reefs. So we have a high resolution model that we can run for many, many years to understand how climate has changed in the past, how it has affected coral bleaching in this area, and then we're now using it to try to understand how we can understand recovery after bleaching events. So remember I mentioned degree heating weeks. That's that measure of heat stress, how long and how hot it has gotten in this area. On the right-hand side is a graph that shows the colors of how severe the bleaching is. And I'm going to show you a video from 1960 to 2006 or 2007 that shows how temperatures have changed over time. And what you want to look for are the more orange and pink colors, because that's where bleaching would be the worst. But the first thing you see is you see this pulse, right? This seasonal pulse of temperature. The blues really aren't very stressful at all. The corals can handle that. But as we move further and further in time, you'll be able to pick out a couple of years that were particularly bad. The year you really want to look at is that 97, 98 period. That was the big El Nino that wiped out a lot of corals. The other thing you want to notice is that there's some areas that really don't get hit very much. And those are the areas we're interested in. Why don't they feel that heat stress? What is it about them? And then the second thing is we see areas which should be bleaching, but they're not. So there's something special about the corals in some of these areas that helps us and the Nature Conservancy go out in the field and say, what is special about these corals? So there's the 98. See that? That was bad. That was a bad year. But you also see that it's just gradually getting more and more stressful for the corals. The other thing we do is once a coral bleaches, or a reef bleaches, we like to see where their larvae come from. Will they come back with larvae that come from another reef? Okay, so where are the source reefs? Where are the reefs that receive most larvae? These are the reefs that are colored. You don't need to know exactly what the colors mean, but they mean different areas, different reef regions. And so when I play this, and I usually play it to Bob Marley music, you can see that how the currents are moving these larvae after a big spawning event into different areas. And we see it actually makes a lot of sense because we see areas where you should see a lot of diversity of corals because they're getting larvae from all over the place. We see areas which get seeding from either cooler areas or warmer areas. Check out the northern Great Barrier Reef. It gets most of its larvae from further south where the reefs didn't bleach. So they're probably going to receive some larvae and reseed. So there's a lot of interesting things we can do to help identify where protection goes. The other thing that's gotten really popular over the last 5 years is something called reef restoration. This is just like forest restoration, right? You grow corals, and then you plant them out back on these reefs that have been damaged, okay? Who would have thunk it, right? Again, 10 years ago when we were starting to talk about this, there were a ton of people said, you can't do it, you'll never be able to grow them, there's too many problems. But there have been some people that really pushed this and are doing a great job at it. So this is an example of like a coral garden. These are structures, and if you look closely at these structures, there's little corals. This endangered species, the staghorn coral, is hanging on these structures, growing mid-water, and they will be harvested and planted back on the reef. Right? This is in Florida. People also try all kind of techniques to grow them. That's, again, the same sort of thing. You can grow them in the lab on these little pedestals. I got a couple of them here. You know, you can grow them on top of these little pedestals. And then when they're grown out, you just take a drill underwater, you drill a hole in the reef, and you put that in, and it'll start growing a coral, right? It's just like plants. Or you can build these kind of things. This is something I've been playing around with, or these kind of, they look like an old antenna, right? They call them trees. So it's a coral tree. So one of the things I did over a sabbatical over the last 6 months was to begin a reef restoration project in Costa Rica. Of course, after I had planned it, it had one of the worst bleaching events it ever could possibly imagine, right? So you go down there and you're like, oh, I'll never get this project off the ground. So here's Costa Rica here in this area. And this is an area where we're doing the project called Golfo Dulce. Has anyone been to Golfo Dulce? I run into a lot of boulder people down there. So it's a pretty popular place for boulderites. It's beautiful. It doesn't have great reefs. It's got about 10 species of corals, about 4 that are really important. But those reefs are amazing. They really are tough corals, and they really support a lot of biodiversity for the rest of this Gulf. It's a really interesting place. You can almost make out maybe some of the reefs in this photograph along this area here. Most of the corals look like this. They're dome corals. There's a few branching corals. But on the right-hand side, I got a video sent to me by a young woman before I even went down there and said, what's happening to the corals? And a lot of the locals down there, she knew it was happening. She knew it was bleaching. But a lot of people think this is beautiful, and they want them to stay that way. So there's not an understanding that this is really a sick coral. I mean, they look beautiful. They're stark white. You can see them from the boat, no problem. But it was vast. It was a severe bleaching event. And I got in the water shortly after this in April, and they still looked like this, right? And so they stayed bleached for a long time. And so it was really, I was pretty depressed, but we decided to start the project anyway. And here are some of my colleagues, and I just want to point out, this was my host, Jorge Cortez, the professor at the University of Costa Rica. And then these two 26-year-old students were fantastic. They did everything with me. through the failures and the successes that we had. So Jose Andres and Tatiana, I have to give them a real call out. And this is what we did. First thing we had to do is wait for the corals to recover. Okay? A lot of them didn't. A lot of them died, but a lot of them did recover, and I was surprised by that. There were a lot of legalities, a lot of stamps you got to get before you can go out and do this work. So we got that in place, and then we started sampling the corals. We usually didn't have to break a piece off the coral. There was enough anchor damage where we could collect what we call fragments of opportunity that we could work with. They look something like that, or that. And we would take them into, this was a local resort that gave us a place where we could use a diamond saw here to cut them into little fragments. We super glue them onto those little mushroom-shaped ceramic discs. Put them into trays that look something like that. And then we hang them on the tree. We go out in the field and we start our nursery. So first time we went out, we hung probably 120 corals out there. And just go back the next week and check on them and see how they're doing. And when I went out the next week, about half of them were gone. The little ceramic disc was still there, but the coral was gone. And I thought, oh, God, we must have not glued them properly, or we didn't have the right glue, or maybe there was something wrong with the disc. So, we go back in the lab, and we're trying the glues and this. And we'd glue these sample corals, and then you're like, you can't get them off, right? We couldn't figure out what we were. And then we thought, well, there's a lot of fish out there, right? A lot of these fish, and it's like there's a population explosion, and they're a trigger fish. And everywhere you go, there's just thousands of them, and they're really cool fish. We love them. They call them chanchos down there. Chancho means pig, okay? So we decided to devise something called DEX, or Disportativos Exclusor de Chanchos, okay? That just means pig exclusion devices, okay? I didn't make this up. These kids did this stuff. So anyway, you can just check out the teeth on those things, right? All right, so we're getting closer. So we built these devices. Well, first of all, we did build the devices, and we had some success. But I just want to say, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still going to be a pig, okay? Thing is, we did not want to blame these fish. It was amazing. We didn't want to blame these fish because the fish are very helpful when you're doing this. They can keep your structures clean. They keep everything off of them, right? We didn't want them to eat our corals, but they did. So we put down these devices, and all it is just a little grid like you use in your garden. It keeps the chanchos out, and we have great growth rates here. Great growth rates. So this is just 1 month. On the left is really the original size of the coral, and on the right is that same coral after it's grown. In 1 month, it's increased its surface area by 30%. So we were really excited about these results. This is a key to why this area is probably good for growing corals. Okay, that's a fun part, right? That is fun, going out there and growing these corals. But you can grow them all you want, right? And if you're not growing the right corals, they're probably still going to bleach again. Well, nature helped us. Nature told us which ones were better adapted. They were the ones that came back, right? They were the ones that didn't bleach in the first place. So those are the ones we were using. We were letting nature tell us what to use. But sometimes that's not enough. So people now are trying to make what we call, use what we call assisted evolution to speed up the evolution of these corals, which we do all the time anyway with plants, right? And crops. We crossbreed them till we find something that's really hardy to frost or increase drought or whatever. And they're trying to do the same thing with the corals. It's a little more complicated because remember, a coral, there's two pieces. There's the coral and there's the algae. The algae have different species too, or at least different clades. So when a coral bleaches, it can take in a different algae, and it might be more resilient to temperature. They can swap out those algae and change the performance of that coral under stressful conditions. So people are experimenting. They're trying to see if they can grow better algae, and they can see if they can grow better corals that are more adapted. It's a lot of genetics work to do that. So assisted evolution is basically just using natural selection and selective breeding, or well, in this case, this is selective breeding. They're collecting the sperm and the eggs in a spawning event. They do a lot of mixing from different parent colonies, take them in the lab, and they see which ones do better under low pH and high temperature conditions, and those are the ones they culture for planting in the field. It's just like what they do with plants. So the last thing which people are trying is genetic engineering, and that's more controversial because people don't know, people just are nervous about genetic engineering, and I don't have a lot of comments on it. I just think that it's important to explore this stuff, maybe not implement it, but explore it and be ready in case we need to pull that tool out of the box with future climate change. One of the last things I'll talk about is assisted migration. That's pretty simple. That's just taking a coral from some place like the Red Sea. These Red Sea corals can take a lot of heat. It's really hot in there. So if you take a coral from there, which is evolved to handle heat stress, and you moved it to another reef, maybe it's going to be better at handling temperatures, which don't get as hot as in the Red Sea. There's a lot of controversy about that, because we don't like moving species around because we can get invasive species. This is the orange cup coral, which is an invasive species in the Gulf of Mexico. Or we can get hitchhikers, like this algae, which can grow and outcompete the corals. Okay? So you have to be really careful. It takes a lot of planning, and this is where I said as we go try things that are more and more risky, right? We have to be careful about what we do. And then finally, the most drastic thing is if we can't save reefs, we can maintain them in ecosystems like in large aquaria, or we can use cryogenics to freeze the coral eggs and sperm and save those until the conditions get back. People are definitely working on that. So there's a lot of tools in the box. We don't want to get this far. We want to keep things down in the lower ranges of these things. So to get back to this, we're doing a lot of this right here now. Okay. Some of this and considering some of this. Okay. But again, the smartest thing to do is to just keep this curve down. The smartest thing to do, the cheapest thing to do, is to invest in renewable energy and things to keep us closer to this curve than this curve. That way we won't have to try all these drastic things and introduce new risks into the system. So what do we do? We have to get off of our habit. In this case, I'm comparing carbon dioxide to smoking, or fossil fuel burning to smoking. So smoking-related health problems. There's a lot of health problems related with smoking. They have one root cause. The best thing to do is to quit smoking, right? But it's hard to do. I don't blame people. I have family members that have smoked, and it's really hard to quit. So what do? You treat the symptoms that you have rather than the cause, and then you ask the patient to eliminate other stressors. Just like climate change and ocean acidification, both of those have one root cause. It's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So until we can quit the fossil fuel addiction, we have to start doing these things. We have to treat the symptoms rather than the cause, and then we have to eliminate the other stressors. And then the third point here is we've got to try some things that can bridge these ecosystems through to the future. So in conclusion, has this ecosystem met its match? That's the question I would pose, and a lot of people can judge that for themselves. And I would say that coral reefs are definitely challenged by climate change. I don't want to be Pollyanna and say there's no problem, they will adapt. They do adapt, and they can adapt rapidly, but probably not fast enough. But in the meantime, while we figure out how to control our fossil fuel habit, there's a lot we can do to reduce this challenge for coral reefs. First thing is to keep fossil fuel emissions down, but we can clean up other stresses. We can improve our conservation planning, like I was showing with some of the modeling work that we've done. And we can learn how to grow corals better, and we can grow better corals. Okay? So people always want to know what they can do. And the best thing I can point them to is this NOAA flyer that tells you all kind of things you can do to help coral reefs. It's pretty basic. But it's out there and it's easy to find. If people want a copy, I'm happy to send it to them. But I like to just put it at a higher level than that. I'd like to say, what can you do? I think one most important thing right now is to vote your conscience, okay? Understand what you're voting for when it comes to climate change. You're not just voting for whether it's going to get hot or not. You're voting for a lot of ecosystems out there and not just coral reefs. The second thing is support conservation of all natural ecosystems. I don't want to be biased to reefs. They're really beautiful. We want to save them, but what about mudflats and other things that we want to keep? The other thing is reduce your own carbon footprint. I think people in Boulder know how to do that. Again, I'm happy to provide information on that if you want it. I think some of the last two are the most powerful. I think sharing your fascination of nature with others is so contagious that the more you do it, the more it draws people in their own appreciation of the nature of the planet. I mean, this is a really amazing planet. And then the last one is never stop learning. I think we can't shut down. Even if we're depressed, we can't shut down. We have to keep learning and looking for solutions. And when you're optimistic, you'll find them. And that's it. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Joanie. So we have lots of room for questions, and we have 2 microphones in the room, so just reach your hand up, and we'll come to you with a microphone.
Hi, thank you so much, Joanie. Do you know much about Fukushima?
About Fukushima? Yeah. Is this one of the places? Yeah. Actually, this is an interesting thing about coral reefs. The reefs there look great. The physical damage and probably some of the radiation damage really hurt some of the reefs where there were nuclear. Are you talking about Japan? Yeah. In Japan. The nuclear activity on a lot of these things, that was going back to like Bikini Atoll and places like that, where they're exposed to radiation, they're doing fine. And one of the reasons is when there's radiation in these areas, it keeps people out. It's the same thing where in some places like in Cuba or in places in Puerto Rico and places where there's mines, no people go in there and those reefs look fabulous. They can still bleach, but because they don't have many stresses, they tend to come back. They tend to have more resilience and they tend to recover more quickly. Maybe that's a good thing right now. I don't know. But no, I don't think people have found any evidence that there's any genetic damage in those animals. So that was always a surprise to me, too. So the most I know is some of these atolls where they did the nuclear tests. And they took a big hit from the physical impact, but then they recovered, and they're beautiful. Yeah. Surprise.
I want to thank you for your passion, because we need more folks like you who really are educating. My question is, how do we educate in all the places around the world where coral reefs are being affected? Are those governments and educational systems, universities in those countries, how robust are they starting to get around a presentation like this one where people in the country and locals, because I do a lot of diving down in the Caribbean and the Caymans, and they're really getting their head around it, a lot of things, and you got to get the locals to really get on the page. And I was just wondering, in places around where you've been and around the world, do you see the education around this? Because you're increasing our education tonight.
Yeah.
So where do you see that around the world? Is that happening?
I do see it. It's never as much as you need, right? There's always communities that are hard to reach. I know in that Coral Triangle region, there's a lot of groups, and most of their effort has to do with working on the ground in the communities, helping them understand their own system, engaging them into taking pride in their system and protecting it. So you don't want to just tell them what to do. You have to work with them and ask them what they think they need to do, and that's very effective. This work in Golfo Dulce that we're doing, so much of that is working with the people and engaging the people. I tell, the students, I don't want to be a gringa that comes down there and tells them what to do. So I have them do the talking, And the young woman that I'm working with, half of her thesis is to work with the communities, the fishing communities, the tourism communities, to really engage them and get them involved in this project and give them ownership of it. And then they see, the main thing is trying to get them to have a monetary feedback. I mean, these people have to eat, right? So if you can find a way for people to support their families with conservation, that's the most powerful thing you can do. Then they'll protect it. So it's a great point. I'm really glad you brought it up, because none of these efforts that we're talking about here will ever work unless you get the local communities behind it. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So is the Great Barrier Reef recovering?
It's a little early to tell right now. It has recovered from past events. Recovery is an interesting term. Sometimes they recover from larval dispersal. Sometimes they recover because the fragmentation in the corals just start growing from the few colonies that are left. And also, recovery can often take 10, 20, or more years to really understand what the full recovery is going to be, because you may lose some of the species that you had in there. They won't go extinct, but locally you lose the distribution of some of those corals. In the Great Barrier Reef, the bleaching has stopped, as far as I know, and now the corals they're doing surveys now just to see how many have died, but I'm sure there's already some recovery going on. As long as the temperatures drop to normal, there have been some amazing, like Lazarus stories, where a coral looks completely dead and somehow it comes back. So just a few polyps can bring a coral back. So there's some really good stories. And another thing I failed to mention about recovery, it seems that food in the water column is really important to these bleached corals. So when they lose their ability to photosynthesize, they can still feed. Some of the corals can still feed with their polyps on stuff in the water column, because they're carnivores too. So they'll feed this, and they can hold on for a while, or they can recover more quickly. So there's a lot of factors that still learning on how to enhance recovery, or how to find places that are more likely to survive events like this into the future. It's a really good question, though.
Joanie, after the you mentioned it, right now the coral reefs are accounting for about 1% of ocean floor.
Yeah.
Historically, over the last couple 100 million years, what do you know about the history of coral reefs? Have there ever been 10% of the ocean floor, or 0.5%, or where are we stand now?
Well, in the last few million years, I think 1% is pretty high. I mean, if we look at where, not today, I mean, we have less than 1% today based on the fact that we're killing some off, but let's say before we started burning fossil fuels, 1% of the ocean is occupied by reef. That's quite a bit, because they can only live in shallow waters. So if we look at the continents and we look at the continental shelf and where the reefs are growing, right? When sea level is high, like it is right now, the coral reefs can occupy all this continental shelf place. That's the shallow areas that surround our continents, about something less than 30 meters or so, where they can live. When sea level was further down, much lower, and it was the last, even 18,000 years ago, sea level was down by about 120 meters from where it is today. So they were living on this continental slope, so there's just a little strip that they could occupy. So when natural processes, there's natural glacial, interglacial cycles, and the continental shelves flooded, boy, these reefs just had a heyday. And the first project I worked on here at NCAR was calculating the effect of this growth of corals, this rapid growth of corals on the continental shelf at about 8,000 years ago, what that did to our climate. So it's all related. That's a good question. I've never heard that question before, though.
I'm just curious again. So where's it going? We're trending down.
Yes.
But is there the possibility that it can naturally come back?
Yes. Yes, I think we definitely. I think the reefs can come back. I think these reef restoration techniques and these reseeding techniques. I definitely think we're not there yet, right? But I think we can bring reefs back. I have a colleague in Florida. His goal before he retires, I think he's 65 now, is to plant 1 million corals. He's getting there, right? So.
Just as an aside, I live in Florida, and as the ocean's going to rise,
Yeah.
it can turn all of Florida into a giant coral reef.
You could. You could expand. It's a great point. So, get your tourism operator's license right now.
So as the oceans get warmer, are there any areas that the reefs are naturally moving into that were previously inaccessible?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is already migration. There's like two answers to your question. So there's already some corals that have migrated up the Florida coast as the waters have gotten warmer, right, with higher latitudes. So we tend to see them move, individual corals move into higher latitudes. The problem, what we think the problem's going to be, is that ocean acidification is pushing them in the opposite direction. So we may have a few corals migrating up these coasts, and we see the same thing in Japan, places like that, but they won't build reefs because the pH is going to be too low in the future. So, but it's very hopeful that we can at least keep some of these coral species, maybe finding new niches to occupy, new regions to occupy. And that's one of the things we try to do with modeling, is are there new areas that could open up that we could utilize?
I was at an educator workshop down in Gulf of Mexico this summer, and we saw coral cores. Is it possible to genetically test those cores so that you can see what was there in the past, or whether bleaching events have recovered, or are all skeletons the same?
Hey, that's cool. So people have been able to identify coral species, but the genetics is an interesting question. I used to do reef coring, and we used to come up with coral cores, and sometimes you see some of these organic bands in there that may be preserved coral tissue or some part of the coral where you could get genetic analysis. I don't know if anybody's doing that. That would be really cool to see. Yeah. Like bones that we find, of humans way back when. Yes.
Joanie, can you speak about what runoff from pollution, how it affects the coral, and what happened in the Gulf of Mexico with the oil leaking from that oil spill? What effects does that have on the coral, especially like pesticides and things like that?
Yeah, all those things can affect corals. Anything from just sediments running off to herbicides and insecticides, oil pollution, all of those things have effects on corals. So, but there has been a lot of work to clean up waters that are, particularly in places like Florida and the Gulf of Mexico coast, where they don't apply pesticides, let's say, during coral spawning season, because that has a lot of effects on the coral spawning. They try to control their runoff. They've gone through and reduced. One of the diseases that affected corals comes from humans, so it was a crossover. It was killing off sea fans, and it was coming in through septic tanks. So they've gone through and they realize that disease is a big part of the corals being hit by these polluted conditions. This just invites disease. So they've done a lot to take a lot of these communities off of septic tanks and put them onto proper sewage treatment plants. And that's making a big difference in cleaning things up. But farm runoff is one of the worst issues. In the Great Barrier Reef, that's one of the worst things that they've had in terms of impacting the corals, for many reasons that I won't go into.
I know the Pacific Gyre is getting pretty bad with the pollution out there, but somebody just told me the other day that it's mostly Starbucks cups out there. Is that true?
That's interesting. Plastics are really bad in the Pacific Gyre. So plastics are really bad. Starbucks cuts? No. But I've heard of tennis shoes and a lot of things like that. And what's also interesting about corals, and we talk about larval transport, and we see, they can settle on things. People see corals growing on flip-flops and stuff out there, right? So in some ways, maybe they can help dispersal. Who knows? I'm an optimist. I don't. It's kind of interesting. I don't think Starbucks is going to cause an increase in coral recruitment rates, but I hope that's not true. I hadn't heard that.
You showed us some videos of the baby corals settling into spots. What was the time frame of those, and how long is that period when they're vulnerable due to ocean acidification?
So that little wiggling they were doing and all that, I think that was probably, I don't remember the speed of that video. That was at least twice as fast as they go. You can see them moving for sure, but you could tell it was sped up, right, the time lapse. I think it probably generally takes them a few hours or an hour or so to sort of really find the settling space, get in there and secrete their calcium carbonate blue. I can look that up for you. I don't know how long it is. That's it. On a really healthy reef, real estate is everything. One of the highest mortality rates for these corals, these baby corals, there's not a spot. There's no room. So they can't get in there. So the recruitment rates can be low on a really healthy reef, so to speak. But in other areas, they can just huge recruitment events. Spectacular to see some of these things. Where I was working in the Eastern Pacific, you just don't see larvae at all. It's really a different place. They're really sparse. Yes. Hey. You have a question about corals? You can ask it. Yeah, ask it. You can ask me later.
With climate change and the warming of the oceans, are you guys concerned with the probability of higher and more hurricanes and huge storms affecting your restoration efforts, especially in Florida?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean, I had the guy that I've been working with at Moat Marine Lab in Florida. They're very vulnerable to hurricanes. They have lots of baby corals out there growing, and the thing is, those it will be worse. Definitely, the hurricanes will make things worse, but probably not a major deterrent to any of these activities, because even though they might affect one area really hard, they really don't affect everything really hard. So probably the proper thing to do is to space, and they've done this already, they space their restoration efforts out all up and down the Florida Keys so that it's unlikely that everything will get wiped out by one hurricane.
Is artificial structures like sunken ships useful for reef buildup?
It's had a very mixed history. Usually not that good, actually. There are some structures now that people are experimenting with that are specifically to try to really enhance coral growth. And those have had better success than, say, metal structures. You will always get something settling on them, but whether you get the right community to grow and to actually build a coral reef, the way we think about the coral reef, what it is, it's hasn't been that successful. They're really successful as fish habitat, but not so successful as a biodiverse, rich coral community. But people are still trying. It's still worth trying, looking at those. Yes. So the question is, how are the reefs? I think they're doing okay. I think those coral reefs are doing okay right now. I think that is a carbonate platform that they're growing on, and so it might be some of the benefit of that and being out in the middle of the ocean. And they don't grow really, really fast, and there's not a whole lot of species there, but it's definitely doing pretty well. Yeah.
I have a question about your conservation efforts. So you talked a little bit about work with the Nature Conservancy in the Coral Triangle and selecting areas that may be most for protection. But how do you even think about selecting areas to, so for example, the Caribbean reefs are so hard hit from multiple stressors. Do we give up on them? How it's going to be an exponentially increasing effort to protect those reefs, but how do you even make that choice?
So working with the Nature Conservancy has been eye-opening, because here I am, okay, I'm a scientist at NCAR. I've got a model, and I'm going to tell you where to put your conservation, right? So I have all the answers. And then you get in there and you sit at the table with them, and you have about this much information that they're going to use. What they need is to know, what are the people? What are the livelihoods of the people there? What is the government like? What is the monetary support for doing this? So much of it is political and social that goes into the equation. What they're really hoping for is just to have a good idea. What are the principles for looking for where these things should occur? One work we did this year was we realized that larvae coming, there are some places where larvae are coming from reefs that are already in warm water. Well, if those larvae are carrying genetics of higher tolerance to warm water and they're moving into cooler water, that's a good thing. If it's corals that are coming from, larvae coming from reefs in cooler water into warmer water, they may not make it. And so we just kind of give them general principles to look at and general maps of look, this is an area that's never been hit by coral bleaching. We don't know why. Or this is an area where everything says we should see bleaching there, but we don't. There's something special about this environment or those corals. So we try to give them an idea like that. But for me, the eye-opening part is that any conservation effort has to take into account all those things you mentioned, whether it's a good place to conserve, whether the people support it, and whether you can support the people with it. So those are really important issues. It's daunting, but there have been quite a few successes in tackling it in this really interdisciplinary way. I have a lot of questions. You guys are smart. So I had planned the sabbatical, and I'd known my host, Professor Cortez, for a long time. We've been talking about this for a long time. So he had a student in mind when I got there who really wanted to work on this project. So I've been working with her, and then I've had lots of volunteers. I can't handle all the volunteers yet. But there was one person that was really appropriate because he had experience with a lot of these kind of with working in the field and scuba diving and wants to work on coral. So I just happened to pick two wonderful people. And the University of Costa Rica that worked with other people there, other professors too, that were really very supportive. One of the students is a graduate student. The other one is an honors undergraduate student. Yeah, I got lucky.
Wondered whether you have much of a relationship with the business community and entrepreneurs in helping tackle some of the problems that you've highlighted.
So the business community. So I have been approached by people that want to start a business with reef restoration by helping manage volunteers or to raise more money for coral reefs through sort of these educational efforts of taking people to help out with restoration and then encouraging them to support other efforts. So I haven't reached out a lot to the business community, But I have approached people that see if they can help support. Like, this is a one-year project. It's a pilot project we were working on. And I'm trying to raise money to try to keep it going, particularly to help the local communities become involved. So I wish I had another me to do that aspect of what you're talking about, or another colleague to do that. But are you a business representative?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
I don't have much money, though.
It doesn't matter. This stuff is cheap. This restoration's cheap. It's just PVC pipe. The most expensive thing is a 100-pound test line. That stuff is really expensive. And then, an anchor and a few buoys, and all we use for buoys is just empty bottles, empty jug bottles, right? You don't want to put good buoys out there; they'll take them. So we just put empty bottles. It's really cheap.
What's your biggest challenge, temperature or acidification, in trying to get corals to survive?
What do you think it is?
I think it'd be acidification, but
that's good. Yeah. So we get asked that a lot, usually by journalists. Are you a journalist? Okay. So I like to say, bleaching kills the corals, and acidification prevents their ability to come back, right? And so it's kind of like a catch-22, it's hard to say. In the future, acidification is just going to keep getting worse, right? So as acidification gets worse, we really start losing the whole reef, because it will start eroding away faster and faster as the pH goes down more and more. So we start fighting whole habitat issues with acidification. With the bleaching, it's more about the organisms and whether they survive the heat or not. So I can't say which one is worse. It's almost like a time frame. Right now, bleaching is definitely the worst thing, and it's going to get worse. But in the future, acidification may be the final nail.
kind of follow-up to that, is that acidification, does that kind of happen equally out the ocean, or are there hot?
That's also a good question. It actually varies a lot from place to place. So it's been really hard to document on reefs to actually see acidification happening, because it's just like climate. It's just got all this variability. One of the reasons it has all this variability is the organisms change the pH themselves, because they respire CO2, and then plants take up CO2. And so it goes back and forth. So you try to see this signal, right, and all this noise of the pH changes, but people are starting to see it. So it just takes a long time, a lot of observations. But there's some hope in some of that, right? So some people are trying to plant algae that you can harvest to actually suck up the CO2 around the reefs and keep the pH higher. So there's ways we can manipulate some systems, maybe, by doing those kind of things. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sounds like the adaptation.
So it is 8:30 right now, so we're going to end the official Q&A period, but we don't want any question to go unanswered, so Joanie's going to stay as long as there are questions. So please come on up if you still have questions. We would really appreciate it if you take a minute to fill out your surveys.
Hey, thanks for coming. I hope we answered some of your questions.